Peace. Should we do it in the dark or the light? I don't know. I kind of like the mystery. It's a little mysterious. I kind of blend in, but then this one is like... I think I'm going to leave the light on. All right. Hey, y'all. It's Morgan Renee Myers tuning in with you all for another story time with More Mind. We are in the book Recapturing the African Mind by Bruce Bridges. We are on chapter number 5. I'm going to hop right into it. This title is in chapter... This chapter is entitled Early Missionary Explorers / Merchants and Colonial Methods of Control. He starts each chapter off with a song line from Bob Marley, and this one is "To divide and rule could only tear us apart." Peace, Brother Clement. So here we go. One of the pioneer missionaries and explorers of Africa was David Livingstone. Livingstone was born in Scotland and spent almost 30 years of exploration in southern Africa. He was sent there in 1840 by the London Missionary Society. This part of Africa was almost totally unknown to Europeans. Like other missionary tools of Europe, Livingstone took his mission very seriously. His mission was to stop the slave trade and to explore places unknown to him. Livingstone was married to the daughter of a missionary in the Bachuna territory of Zimbabwe by the name of Mary Moffat. Her father, the Reverend J.S. Moffat, was instrumental in the theft of Zimbabwe. Peace, cuz! Livingstone traveled back and forth from Africa to England and became the British consulate and commander of an expedition to explore Eastern and Central Africa. As a political representative of Britain and a missionary, Livingstone was an excellent person to further the mercantile interests of the Crown. Catholic and Protestant organizations sent more expeditions to East Central Africa after recognizing the influences of Livingstone's writings. The response by both Catholic and Protestant organizations was tremendous. Even Romanticism was used to explain the deaths of many of the missionaries. Although they often died of fever, drowning, or at the hands of the indigenous population, deaths were considered heroic deeds and marvelous tragedies. Wait, I think I skipped ahead. No? Okay. I'm proud of you too, Clement. Thank you, good brother. All right, let me go back. So the response by both Catholic and Protestant organizations was tremendous. Even Romanticism was used to explain the deaths of many of the missionaries. Although they often died of fever, drowning, or at the hands of the indigenous populations, deaths were considered heroic deeds and marvelous tragedies by great Christian men of God. There were two effects that this Romanticism engendered in the European mind. One was that the African was indeed a dark, dangerous, and savage country, and that needed European civilization. Another was that these missionaries, explorers, and traders were of sterling quality and character. So romanticizing being used in the sense of like not telling them full selves the truth about how it is, making it sound good or better than what it really is. So the Africans, they are dark, dangerous, and it's a savage country, and we're coming in to help them, to civilize them. That's romanticizing the situation, because we didn't need that at all. Another was that these missionaries, explorers, and traders were of sterling quality and character. They thought they were very upright, outstanding men doing the work of God. This reasoning, gathered from the reading of Livingstone's writings, guaranteed to European Christian societies that their missions were blessed by God. The role of European missionary groups was also important in the extension of European imperialism to Africa. During the 19th century, there were several of these operating on the continent. Below is a list of societies responsible for influencing minds of Africans: Methodist Missionary Society, Church Missionary Alliance, Church Missionary Society, American Presbyterian Church, Catholic Missionary Societies, White Fathers, Catholic Ghost Fathers. Once the various missionary societies gained total influence upon the minds of the Africans, they would wrap themselves into European culture on all levels. This would occur even in situations when it appeared that Africans were thinking and acting independently. Walter Rodney, the Guyanese author, states it this way in his book, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. At the social and cultural level, there are many features which aid in keeping underdeveloped countries integrated into the capitalist system and at the same time hanging onto the apron strings of the metropoles. The Christian church has always been a major instrument for cultural penetration and cultural dominance, in spite of the fact that in many instances Africans sought to set up independent churches. Equally important has been the role of education in introducing Africans to serving the capitalist system and to subscribe to its values. Recently, the imperialists have been using new universities in Africa to keep themselves entrenched at the highest academic level. So that's from a book by Walter Rodney called How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. The Berlin Conference. After well more than 400 years of contact with Africa, claims were laid during the second half of the 19th century by Europe. The explorers had been many. Richard Burton, Grant Speke, Mungo Park, David Livingstone, and Stanley had studied the geography of the continent. These explorers had greatly increased the knowledge of Europe of the interior of Africa. Speke and Burton had explored the East, David Livingstone explored Central Africa, and Park traveled in the West. These adventurers and explorers were supported by the European business community or by Christian missions. Moreover, governments of Europe began sending their official representatives to Africa to expand trade notes. An association was founded by Leopold II of Belgium called the Berlin Conference. On November 15, 1884, the Belgian monarch laid claim to the Congo region of Africa. Otto von Bismarck and Kaiser Wilhelm opened the meeting in the name of Almighty God. There were 14 states of Europe and the United States in attendance. Historically, the United States claims that she had nothing to do with this conference and Africa's partitioning. Ben Jochannan calls this the master lie of them all. There were 3 men representing the USA at the Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1887, and they were 1. John A. Casson, an American minister to Germany who served in the Iowa legislature and the House of Representatives. Casson had knowledge of the potential wealth of the Congo Basin. He also desired to have large numbers of missionaries in the Congo for conversion purposes. Number 2 was Henry Shelton Sanford, former American minister to Belgium and active sympathizer to King Leopold and his schemes. In 1886, the Sanford Exploring Expedition was established. This expedition was given the first ivory trade concession in the Congo region of Africa. And 3, Henry Morton Stanley, a member of the Confederate Army and later the United States Navy. Stanley came to America from Wales on a ship to New Orleans, Louisiana. At the time of the Berlin Conference, he regarded himself as an American citizen and was financed by the United States. The same nations involved in robbing Africa of its human resources were about to embark upon other means of raiding Africa. King Leopold II, a devout Catholic, took the largest and richest territory. While all of this was taking place, there were no African nations represented. At the beginning of the conference, approximately 80% of Africa was under traditional rule. European gangsters proceeded to draw boundary lines. These lines were sometimes erased and redrawn. Hinterlands were disrupted, African families were separated, and ethnic distinctions were totally ignored. Greedy European powers argued over territories and river trade routes along the Niger and Congo. To no less degree, there was conflict over African rubber, ivory, and particularly palm oil, which was becoming increasingly important to Western industrial development. A new form of slavery called colonialism was being established. With the onslaught of colonialism came further destruction of the African mind. Even with the independence of African nations, mind destruction continues. Kwame Nkrumah termed it neo or new colonialism. Okay, so this is a picture of Africa after the partition. So after this Berlin Conference and all these Europeans deciding what's best for Africa and splitting it up into who's what. So it's color-coded by who get what section of Africa. The word colon is the root of the word colony. In the human body, natural creation, the colon is an extension of the large intestine. Similarly, the colony, African nation, is an extension of an imperialist European nation. The mentality found in the African colony is also the same as in the European nation. Thus, the mindset of Europe is placed in the heads of indigenous people everywhere that Europe has colonized. While each of the colonizing European nations had its own methods of control and administration over the Africans, according to Albert Memmi in The Colonizer and the Colonized on page 149, colonialism is above all economic and political exploitation. According to James Hatch in his book entitled The History of Britain in Africa, perhaps the biggest disturbance caused to African social life by colonial rule came from the growth of missionary activities. Many missions had established their first footholds in Africa before the partition of the continent. Under colonial rule, they were encouraged by governments and found greater opportunities to extend their own initiatives. Clearly, the colonial administrations of Europe realized that religion wielded on tremendous impact upon the African mind and consequently aided in larceny of the resources. It is an impossibility to separate Western commerce and civilization from the knowledge of the European God. A good example of how missionaries served as agents of European colonial expansion can be seen in the colonization of Zimbabwe, once called Rhodesia, after the colonizer Cecil Rhodes. Zimbabwe is located in southern Africa. Cecil John Rhodes, born on July 5, 1853, died on March 26, 1902, and was buried at the World's View in the Matopo Hills in Zimbabwe, southern Africa. He was the son of a vicar in Huddersfield, England. Although never considered a brilliant student, he was said to be a hard worker who loved history and geography. The Reverend Rhodes wanted Cecil to enter the ministry, but he was not inclined in that direction. Cecil was more enthusiastic about law. He never had the chance to go to law school because there was a history of tuberculosis in the family and his lungs became weak. A family doctor thought a sea voyage would do him good, so he joined his brother living in the British colony of Natal in southern Africa, where thousands of English pioneers were living. Rhodes, like other European explorers and travelers to Africa, was filled with an avid interest in the continent. He, as well as other Europeans of the time, possessed a Eurocentric worldview. In the late 18th and 19th centuries in Britain, there was a wave of Eurocentric Christian evangelism. The intent of this evangelism was to convert the earth's heathen people. The white supremacist mentality of Rhodes developed further when he saw blacks working under whites in the colony. This mentality had been evolving since his early days and continued into his years at Oxford University. Rhodes's mind began accepting works such as Charles Darwin's Origin of the Species. This work was an extension of Rhodes's early education about the supremacy of England and its annexations around the world. Darwin used the doctrine of the natural law of selection and the concept of survival of the fittest as justification for the destruction of African people. Darwin's theory was representative of the mental environment of all England during the time of Cecil John Rhodes. As Rhodes voraciously read every book he could acquire on the history of Africa, its geography, and its people, he became totally fascinated by the dark continent. Naturally, his reading came from the early adventurers onto the continent who wrote of the pagan, savage, childish, hut-dwelling natives that needed assistance from the British. This Anglo-centric background and Anglo-centric reading was for Rhodes a tremendous inspiration when he fell under the influence of John Ruskin at Oxford University in England. Ruskin, a lecturer at the university, directed Rhodes towards a purpose in life. In actuality, one of the many lectures of Ruskin provided a basis for the already developing imperial mentality of the student Rhodes. In that particular lecture, the superior thinking of Ruskin and of England in general emanates. Moreover, Ruskin understood the involvement of England in commercial competition and used his classroom lectures to inspire Oxford students to work for England. He stated, "There is a destiny now possible to us, the highest ever set before a nation, to be accepted or refused. Will you youths of England make your country again a royal throne of kings, a sceptred isle for all the world, a source of light, a center of peace, mistress of learning and other fine arts, faithful guardian of time, tried principles under temptation from fond experiment and licentious desires, and amidst the cruel and clamorous jealousies of the nations worshipped in her strange valor of good wills towards men." What the hell are he talking about? This is what England must either do or perish. She must found colonies as fast and as far as she is able, formed of her most energetic and worthiest men, seizing any piece of fruitful waste ground she can set her foot on, and there teaching her colonists that their chief virtue is to be fidelity to their country, and that their first aim is to advance the power of England by land and by sea. There are men who will plow and sow for her, who will behave kindly and righteously for her, and who will bring their children to love her, and who will be glad in themselves in her glory more than all the light of the tropical skies. You think it is an impossible ideal. Be it so. Refuse to accept it if you will, but see that you form your own in its stead. All that I ask of you is to have a fixed purpose and of some kind for your country and for yourselves, no matter how restricted, so that it be fixed and unselfish. With this speech by Ruskin firmly ingrained in his mind, Cecil Rhodes, the British imperialist, proceeded to plan the theft of the resources of Zimbabwe. The general spread of Western civilization was not separated from the missionary role. One African writer made the following statement as quoted in The African Heritage. Under the missionary wing, later comers were able to make peaceful contact. It was often the missions which made occupation possible. Exploitation, the opening of the businesses and concessions, sprang up and flourished in the shade of the mission. After Rhodes formed the De Beers Company and consolidated gold fields, he planned to expand British colonialism into the country north of the Limpopo River. The Matabele king, Lobengula, had been contending with the Portuguese, the Dutch, and the Germans for what was considered his rich territory. Rhodes hastily sent the Reverend J.S. Moffat, missionary, to King Lobengula to secure peace with the British and to get the king to desist from selling any territory or signing treaties with any other foreign state. Moffat, who was a brother-in-law of the missionary David Livingstone, lived and worked in Bulawayo and had befriended Lobengula as a counter to the Dutch. Moffat struggled in conversations with the king since he was trying to get an agreement during the festival season of the great dances of Zimbabwe. As stated in J.G. MacDonald's Roads of Life, having advanced so far, Moffat, who understood the native mind, decided to wait a while and not risk an appearance of wishing to hurry the king into further decisions. With this intricate knowledge of the native mind, the British were successful in getting the king to sign what was known as the Moffat Treaty. Rhodes was joyous of the fact that Moffat, missionary, had secured a treaty from Lobengula, but he also realized that something had to be done to gain a firmer footing for his imperial scheme to work. Hastily, Rhodes sent an old friend and business partner, Charles Rudd, attorney Rockford McGuire, and Frank Thompson, who was very skilled at speaking the Ndebele language. These three were to obtain a concession from Lobengula to all the minerals in his territory. Assisting in the scheme to gain control of the minerals was the Reverend C.D. Helm, who, as a resident missionary, exerted a strong spiritual influence over Lobengula. Helm, as a double agent, posed as a friend to the king, while in actuality he was an agent of imperialism. By making false promises of fictitious benefits, the Right Reverend Missionary Helm actually persuaded the king to sign the Rudd Concession on October 13, 1888. The Reverend C.D. Rudd, in addition to being a friend and business partner, was also a paid employee of Cecil Rhodes. The concession was written in English using legal jargon which overwhelmed Lobengula. It was a ploy for the purpose of colonizing the land of Zimbabwe. The other missionary, John Smith Moffat, a professed friend of Lobengula, rejoiced 2 days after the signing. He wrote, "As a military power, it will be a blessing to the world when the Matabele are broken. I'm sure that their days are numbered." Such were the lies, deceit, and chicanery and double-dealing tactics that were used by the Rhodes gang to secure Zimbabwe. Due to Rhodes' schemes and help from the missionaries and other gang members, he was able to leave large sums of money for white students to study at Oxford University. This tremendous endowment, commonly known as the Rhodes Scholarship and revered by many blacks, was made possible by Rhodes' theft of Zimbabwe's resources. There were several factors which made it possible for Africa to be divided into political and economic economic colonies of Europe, but the role of the missionaries cannot be overemphasized. In every case, there was missionary involvement. Large capitalists of Europe understood that to control raw materials, markets, finance, and other opportunities in Africa, there must be a scramble for the minds of its people. Dang, I ain't know the Rhodes Scholarship had history that deep. Better be looking up who these old white men money come from. That don't mean I won't take it though and let it impact my life. Because, honey, I ain't got nothing to do with back then if it's still available to me now, okay? I could just do what I can do with it now. British control and direct rule. Britain initially ruled by arbitrarily appointing governors and administrative staffs. In doing so, the British governor was the mind controlling Africans under the British crown. The governor was in effect the head mind over the body in the colonized country. Hence, there was no need to pay attention to existing tribal chiefs, custom, and traditions in those countries. The standard of indirect rule became the policy of the British administration. While traditional laws were applied when it was convenient to do so, the ultimate law was the law handed down to the Africans in the British colonies by England. Indirect rule sounded like local autonomy or self-determination, but this was superficial at best. The system operated with the mind of Britain controlling taxation, choosing administrative officers, and setting agendas for governance. Although chiefs may have been chosen by their people, their authority was known by all to reside in the power of the British. Accordingly, a complacent form of control was instituted by the British by making Africans seem to be in control when, in fact, total control was in the hands of the British. Jan Smuts and Boer leader and Frederick Lugard exercised a dominant influence on British colonial policies. In a book entitled The Dual Mandate in British Tropical Africa, Lugard wrote that the imperial responsibility was to develop Africa's resources as a contribution to the world economy. Secondarily, African people would also benefit from the progress. The mandate became the book for the British colonial office, second only to the Bible. The thesis of the mandate provided Britain with what is called an ethical justification for its imperial position. The policy was to form alliances with the established local authorities, i.e. chiefs and tribe leaders, to fulfill these responsibilities. Every British administrator was to accept the lesson of Lugard. He believed in European education for some African students. Due to the nature of the education, he expected it to induce Africans to be more obedient to authority. That authority was to be European policy. As a few colleges in Ghana were being formed, students' learning was going further than what Lord Lugard anticipated. They were being introduced to political, social, and economic thinkers of other countries. In Sierra Leone, Fora Bay College began to focus beyond the missionary training. In the Gold Coast, Ghana, professors were encouraging students to pursue higher studies. With this spark of anti-colonial spirit, students traveled to London and America for education. One such person was Nnamdi Azikiwe, who, after returning to Nigeria from Lincoln University in Pennsylvania, initiated an African press with a theme for African independence. French control, assimilation. Okay, so British control was indirect rule. French control was assimilation. The doctrine of France towards its African colonies was assimilation. The French believed that civilization should be shared by every single person living under French rule. They were desirous of creating an overseas France in all of their African colonies. The goal was to totally acculturate Africans into French life. According to Robert July, the governor of the French administration, sent specific orders to the colonies. The prime mover of the new colony must be European culture, driven by French energy, becoming through example, through persuasion, and through the appreciation of new achievements, the soul of the African. The aim of the French in their colonies was to create a French-speaking, African, acculturated elite. These Africans would be totally immersed in French culture. Their bodies would appear African, but their minds would be French. Training would take place in French universities, and they will become familiar with French politics. After receiving a French education, one might possibly become I don't know how to speak French. What is this? Assimilé. one who could become assimilated into French culture. Along with assimilation came alienation. These French Africans became wearers of French clothing and adhered to all the values of France. Their thinking, due to the policy of assimilation, became corrupt and less African. The African French elite would then become leaders in their countries and would continuously inculcate French culture, politics, and values throughout their nations. Guadeloupe, a personal account. While visiting the small Caribbean island of Guadeloupe, which was colonized by the French, I had a discussion with an African cab driver at the airport. We were discussing my vacation time, and I proceeded to inquire about where he might travel. He said that his plans were to travel to France. The cab driver spoke the French language. He was trained in French history, literature, music, and the like. Moreover, he enjoyed French wine, clothing, and food, and owned a French poodle. For all practical purposes, he was a Frenchman. My question to him was, have you ever thought about going to Africa? The precise answer by the cab driver was that Africa was too far. An examination of a world map would reveal, contrary to the cab driver's assumption, France is actually further away from Guadeloupe than Africa. The problem, of course, is that in the minds of many Africans, Africa has been placed so far away that they think it is impossible to reach. It was also clear while socializing in Guadeloupe that many of the French colonizers had married into the African families so that the control was still in the hands of France. France's colonial empire extended from Senegal eastward to Chad and south to the Congo. In France, all roads lead to Paris, and in Africa, all the islands, in France, all roads lead to Paris, and in Africa and the islands, all roads lead to France. French institutions and French culture were the order of the day. Belgian control. Paternalism. The best description of the relationship between the Congo and its colonizer Belgium is paternalism. I said patriotism. Paternalism, a term from the Latin pater, which means father. The word paternalism manifests the arrogance of the Belgians, whose leader was King Leopold, a devout Catholic. Words in the Catholic vocabulary like Pope, which means Papa, Papal, which also means Papa, Mother, Superior, and Father are all words that suggest positions of the Catholics, not only in relation to each other, but even more so in relation to their African converts. Consequently, the paternalistic manner in which Belgians related to Africans in the Congo was influenced by their Catholic religion. Unlike the French, Belgians had no plans of making Belgian Africans. Instead, they wanted to tutor them into the ways of the West as a father rears his children. During colonialism, Rudyard Kipling's idea of the white man's burden was manifested in the Belgian Congo in its purest form. The Belgians, like their other European counterparts, believed that civilization should be brought to areas where darkness reigned. Of course, Belgian and other colonizers cloaked civilization with Christianity. Underlying the destruction of the African mind in the Congo was the acquisition of the natural resources of the area. In 1940, the Belgians established a research institute to study the minerals of the Congo. The Belgian Congo is rich in plant and mineral wealth. It produces diamonds, cobalt, copper, uranium, and rubber. Belgium, as well as other European colonizers, was seeking wealth to uplift the poor economies of Europe. The colonial power structure in the Belgian Congo can be analogized to the Trinity. The Trinity would be described as 1, the administration, 2, the church, and 3, the large companies. Each component had a tremendous impact on the Congo region. The Belgian administration was committed to evangelization as a part of its success in the Congo. Its philosophy was that the government servants did not work alone in the task of civilization. The religious orders also participated in an equal measure. If a person worked in a civil service capacity, that individual was strictly obligated to aid the Christian missionaries. Africans began to question the Christian missionaries. They could not easily see the good that had come with Catholicism. Questions were asked, such as, what good have they brought us? They have given us a road that we do not need, a road that brings more and more foreigners, causing trouble, making our women unclean, forcing us into a new way of life that is not ours, planting crops that we do not want, doing slaves' work. The white man sends us missions to destroy our belief and to teach our children to recite fine-sounding words that we believe anyway, and we live according to our beliefs, which is more than the white man does. Also, no merit was attached to African values, especially since Europeans considered themselves to be superior to Africans. Customs of Africans were thought to be barbaric and should be destroyed and replaced by European standards. The African mind was confused. Confrontation of the two ways of life caused complications in the African mind. It was traumatic to have to decide whether to believe in one's ancestors, the spirit world, and the hereafter, in the face of damnation to eternal darkness, if the admonitions of the white missionaries were to be believed. At least some Congolese who gave up their traditional belief system and accepted the European mentality began to see that doing so meant subjugation rather than liberation. Yes, Mark, of course you can share live, honey, especially if it's public. Come on now. You know I do this for the people. After its independence in 1959, there were several hundred African Catholic and Protestant priests in the Congo. However, in spite of their large numbers, African priests held positions inferior to those of their European counterparts. Religious services were segregated by color, and churches were dominated by white missionaries. The state-funded mission schools used their monies to continuously indoctrinate Congolese children into mental and physical servitude. Thus, Christianity as a liberating force was not something that the Congolese experienced. To the contrary, it engendered and perpetuated mental enslavement and destruction. Uh-oh. Okay. Okay. I'm going to stop right here because I got stuff to do, honey. And need to get on it. So we're still in chapter 5, but it's just talking about the title of this chapter is Early Missionary Explorers and Merchants and Colonial Methods of Control. So he's breaking down how these different regions took control of Africa. So he said the British control was by indirect rule. French control was through assimilation. Belgian control was through paternalism. Portuguese control is through exploitation. That's what I'm going to be reading next. So I'm going to stop here and y'all have a good rest of y'all evening. Peace.